So as you probably remember, in this series of Sangha nights, we're exploring a style of Buddhism called the Vajrayana, the diamond way, the way of the diamond, or the way of the diamond thunderbolt, sometimes also called Tantric Buddhism. And we've heard that that was sort of the third great wave of development of Buddhism, long after the Buddha's death. At a time when maybe the old approaches were getting a bit stale. Maybe the dangerous wild visionaries had been replaced by grey scholars talking about the Dharma and debating about the Dharma in their monasteries and universities. Maybe sometimes Buddhism had become a safe career path that brings status and security. Maybe sometimes people, instead of striving for direct spiritual experience, were content with learning the lists and the orthodoxies. And maybe the whole thing had often become a bit too safe and respectable, too much part of the worldly society that surrounded it. So something new was needed, and that something new was the Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism, the style of Buddhism we're talking about. That was a style of practice that emphasized direct experience, practice in everyday life, energy, and an uncompromising spirit. And that was great, wasn't it? It's really exciting, but it all happened a long, long time ago in a very different world. And I don't think that we can be Tantric Buddhists in the original way, like the original Vajrayana practitioners in our circumstances now. But there's a lot in the Vajrayana that we can use in our practice today, maybe that we need to use in our practice today to give it real vividness and energy. So while we're going to be looking at sort of original Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, we'll be doing that to see how that approach can help our practice, how it can bring color and energy into our practice. Not suggesting that we become medieval Indians or Tibetans or Japanese. So this series is called Tantra Now, not Tantra Then. Tantra Now. How can we put some of those principles and practices into our practice? So both the two earlier great sort of trends in Buddhism, so-called Hinayana and the so-called Mahayana, so-called lesser vehicle and greater vehicle, they both had their strongholds in the monasteries and universities. But the Vajrayana seems to have developed outside the monasteries, outside the universities, in small groups of practitioners centered around a teacher who was may not have been a monk or nun, probably not a monk or a nun, meeting in small groups in a town, in a village, in a royal court, in a slum, or in a clearing in the forest. Small groups of practitioners around a teacher who was called the guru. And as I said 2 weeks ago, it seems that within that context, the tantric approach to Buddhism developed a sort of fusion between Buddhism and magic. Buddhism and village magic, Buddhism and shamanism. So the Vajrayana uses magical techniques, like magic rituals and spells, not to affect the outer world, but to achieve inner spiritual goals. So when a magician casts a spell, they generate powerful emotions. They do things to generate powerful emotions, to sort of, invoke powerful emotions. And then they focus that sort of high voltage mind that they've generated on achieving some goal, like making it rain, or making the crops grow, or destroying an enemy. But the trouble is, that's probably not going to work. It's very unlikely you could make it rain by generating a really powerful desire for it to rain. Focusing all that energy on willing it to rain. But when it comes to inner goals, that is precisely the way that we can make it happen. If we want to overcome some inner obstacle or change some unhelpful pattern, then casting a spell, a so-called spell, that helps us to really want that with all our heart and with all our emotional energy, and helps us to focus our will on it with all that high voltage emotion that we've generated. And maybe that helps us to ask even for some help from some energies, deeper or higher energies than our normal surface rational mind. Well, that sort of spell, is going to be a powerful way of making inner change happen. So magic to make it rain might not work, but magic techniques to bring about change in ourselves is very, very likely to be a powerful way of changing. So Vajrayana practitioners use rituals that are very like spells to achieve spiritual goals. So in a sense, Vajrayana practitioners are magicians. And as I said 2 weeks ago, there's a myth about magicians, or maybe it's 3 weeks ago, there's a myth about magicians, which crops up in the traditional Celtic myth surrounding the magician Merlin. And that myth is that magicians live backwards. So I talked about this 2 weeks ago. Magicians live backwards. So Merlin was said to have been born an old man, and then as he lived, gradually got younger and younger and younger and younger. I don't know what happened when he got to be a little baby, maybe sort of one dreads to think. But sorry, I shouldn't have gone there. Yeah, so he was born a young man, he gradually got older and older and older. No, sorry, he gradually got younger and younger and younger. I don't think that's meant to be taken literally, but I think it's getting at something. And what I think it's getting at is this, that most of us live, if you like, forwards from the past towards the present and the future, which means that what we do now is governed by what has happened before. It's governed by the past. If we were shy in the past, then we feel we are shy in the present. If we weren't good at something in the past, we think we can't be good at it now. The way we were in the past, and all that past conditioning that seems to have made us the way we are, that limits us. That makes us a particular sort of person that we think is just who we are. And it stops us being anything else. So our present, if we live forwards, our present is ruled by our past. But for a magician like Merlin, what rules the way they act in the present is the future. What rules the way they act in the present, what rules the way they live, is what could be. What could be, not what has been. Not the limitations of the past, but the future that's sort of trying to happen. That's what rules their presence, the potential future that could come into existence. So they're living from the future to the past rather than from the future to the present rather than from the past to the present. And what that means in the spiritual life, because Vajrayana practitioners are spiritual magicians, what that means in the spiritual life mainly is that the future potential self that we could be is what rules how we act in the present. So the enlightened self that we could be. We live like a magician when we don't allow our present to be ruled by what we have been in the past, but instead live on the basis of the person we could be in the future. So we imagine, how magnificent could I be? How magnificent could I be? How wise, how brave, how strong, how unaffected by the trivial things that go on around me. How creative, how magnificent could I be? And then we allow that future self to rule the way that we act in the present. not the old self, limited self from the past. We live as the magnificent being we could become, not the limited being we've been in the past. That would be to live backwards. And that's very much the approach of the Vajrayana. So in his book on the Tantric deities, which do have a look at, Vasantra, I ought remember called Vasantra, tells us that one of the important things about Tantric Buddhism is that, as he puts it, Tantra begins at the highest point. Tantra begins at the highest point. And what he means by this is that it begins with our enlightened self, not with the self we have been. It begins with our enlightened self, and it works backwards. So Vajrayana practices often ask us to, the whole Vajrayana approach asks us to act as if we were enlightened now. Do it now, rather than waiting for some future time. It asks us to live like a magician, allowing our potential future self to determine how we live now, not our past. So generally, the Dharma works from the past forwards, okay? That's the way we normally do things, not from the future back. So generally, we do practices that take the person that the past has made us and helps that person to grow into something greater in the future. That's what the Dharma generally is about. And that's been called the developmental model. So that developmental model sees practice as about how we develop, how we grow from the person we are now with the person that the past has made us. And that model is very much one of growth, like the growth of a plant. So like a plant, according to that model, we grow gradually, progressively, with stages that you can't skip. So a plant comes from a seed, it puts out a little root, puts out little leaves, gradually grows, produces stem, flowers, fruits, seeds. If you try and get it to produce a fruit while it's that big, ain't gonna work. You need a big root system, loads and loads of branches. There's stages that have to be gone through. It's progressive. So we grow gradually, progressively, with stages that we can't skip. That's the sort of path of regular steps that Sangha talks about. And that's safe, and that's realistic, and it's really, really necessary. It's a really, really necessary approach to practice, but the Vajrayana approach is different. It's different. It says, just be like an enlightened being, now. And that approach actually can get very badly misinterpreted. It can get very badly misinterpreted. It's got a bit of a bad name sometimes in Triratna, because when people misinterpret it with a sort of arrogant ego attitude, it has led to a lot of silliness. With people saying, well, you can just completely dispense with the developmental model altogether. And people convincing themselves that they are already enlightened, so they don't need to practice. Okay, they are anxious. Okay, they suffer loads of craving. Okay, they suffer loads of ill will. But that's enlightened anxiety. Enlightened craving, enlightened in will. They are already enlightened, which of course is hogwash. We all have the potential to be Buddhas, but deluding ourselves that we are already Buddhas, that's not going to substitute for the effort that we need to make to actually grow. But having said all that, there is something very positive about acting as if we were already enlightened now. If we don't do it sometime, we're never going to do it. And in fact, the Dharma often asks us to act as if, as a practice. It often asks us to act as if. We need to use the model of spiritual growth, if you like, but even that includes an element of acting as if. When we strive to keep the precepts, even if we don't really feel like it, we are acting as if. We are acting as if we were an enlightened being. Only an enlightened being can be completely generous or completely aware. If we perform some act of generosity or kindness when part of us really doesn't feel like it, we are acting as if we were an enlightened being. And by doing that, we come just a little bit more like an enlightened being. So as we do more and more generous acts, more and more kindly acts, we become more and more generous, more and more kind through the action of the law of karma. Those strands in our being that we act upon, they become stronger. Those strands in our being that we don't act upon, don't put our energy behind, they gradually fade away. That's the law of karma. That's how the Dharma mostly works. And there's a big element of acting as if in that, of acting as if we were enlightened. So acting as if isn't really so different from the way we usually practice. And it can bring a sort of radical, vivid dimension to our practice that we need. So the Vajrayana asks us to be a Vajra being living in a Vajra world. We could say a sacred being, living in a sacred world that is full of meaning and color and beauty and mystery. Step up into that. It asks us to do that now, this instant, not wait for some future time that may never arrive, that may just seem to get further and further into the distance. So yeah, acting as if we were already enlightened, bringing the future into the present, the future self into the present, starting from the highest point. That's a feature of the Vajrayana. And it's something that really I think we can bring into our practice. I'll say more about that later. One of the main ways that Tantric Buddhism does that, to ask us to begin at the highest point and act as enlightened beings now, is through what gets called yidam practice or visualization practices, sadhana practices. Most Tantric practitioners, most order members, will have what is called a yidam, a Buddha or a Bodhisattva figure that they have a particular connection with, and that they have developed a particular connection with, that they meditate upon. So order members normally refer to those practices as their sadhana. So order members may have the sadhana of Manjughosha, the Bodhisattva of wisdom with his flaming sword of truth, and a book which, if we could only read it, would solve all our self-created problems forever, which he holds to his heart. Or the sadhana of Tara, the female Bodhisattva of compassion, always stepping down into the world to help, but always at the same time in another dimension, completely unaffected by this world. Or the sadhana of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, but usually not in his human form so much as in a glorified form, as a glowing golden figure of light, an image that shows the true nature of his inner world rather than just his human body. So those are the sorts of sadhanas that order members will do, and a range of other ones. And in many of these sadhanas, we visualize the Buddha or Bodhisattva, as it were, out there, as a glorious, radiant, insubstantial figure of light. And visualize, we talk about them as visualization practices, but visualize is probably not really the right word all the time, because many people find it difficult to visualize, to see a clear image, but can nonetheless have a clear sense of a presence. So at the very least, we have a strong sense of being in the presence of a Buddha or Bodhisattva, a great being, as it were, out there. And we probably, as part of that practice, feel ourselves receiving blessings from that great being, as some of their qualities enter into us, perhaps in the form of radiant light which pervades us, or light flooding into our being and transforming us. maybe as the practice draws towards its close, maybe a tiny, intensely bright emanation of the Buddha or Bodhisattva comes into us and takes its place in our heart and sits there as we go about our life after the practice. So that when we get up in our daily life, we do that with get up from the cushion, enter our daily life. We do that with a sense of the Buddha or Bodhisattva still inside us or still hovering above our head, still guiding and affecting the way we think and the way we feel and the way we act. So the Buddha or Bodhisattva represents what we ourselves could become, our future enlightened self. And we take that with us after the practice. It guides how we act in the present. So once again, the future is guiding the present. And many practices in the Tantric tradition take that even further. So there's practices what are called self-generation practices, where we don't imagine the Buddha or Bodhisattva out there. We imagine ourselves as the Buddha or Bodhisattva. We become that Buddha or Bodhisattva. And then at the end of the practice, we rise from our cushion and go about our life as though we were that Buddha or Bodhisattva. We arise from our cushion as that greater being that we could be, and we live as that being, at least as much as we can in our imagination. So, as I said, the Buddha or Bodhisattva that we're meditating on in those practices, in a way, represents our potential, represents the being we have the potential to become in the future. So whether we feel the figure to be in our heart or hovering above our head, or whether we are the figure, what we're doing is bringing the future, our future possible self, into our present experience and letting that determine how we are as we go about our daily life, rather than being ruled by our past. So we're living like a magician when we do sadhana practice to its fullest. We're bringing the future into the present. So yeah, this sort of practice, yidam practice, sadhana practice, visualization practice, which is such a big feature of Tantric Buddhism, it's probably almost one of the defining features, and which order members take on when they're ordained. It's got a really long lineage. It's not something new. It's got a really long lineage dating right back to the historical Buddha. The practices we do and the sort of Tantric practices, they're a culmination of a long process of development of that sort of practice in the Buddhist tradition. So to get an idea of how it started, how that sort of practice started, it might help to imagine what it would have been like to be around the Buddha while he was alive. So what would it be like to be around a fully enlightened being who was everything represented there, living in front of us, speaking, talking, acting, our ultimate potential, what we could become. We can imagine that if we lived in the presence of the Buddha, we would be constantly reminded of the qualities of enlightenment, of our own potential. Our own potential for those qualities would be awakened and stimulated. We'd see what we could become right in front of our eyes. And that would really speed up our progress. One of the things that's quite fascinating about the Pali Canon, the early teachings, early records of the Buddha, is sometimes how quickly people progress. And you sort of, but maybe that's just got a lot to do with, there was the Buddha right in front of them. So our enlightened qualities would be stimulated and awakened. We could see what we could become right in front of our eyes. And because of that influence, those qualities would inevitably grow and develop and strengthen and become more and more a powerful part of our being, while our more unskillful qualities, our lesser qualities, would tend to fall away. So we can imagine that we'd quite naturally come to act and speak and think more like a Buddha. More like the higher being that we could become ourselves. And this effect of just being around the Buddha was well recognized by most of his disciples. So that when people couldn't be with the Buddha any longer, he was going away or for one reason or another, they were sometimes quite worried, quite disturbed about how they were going to practice, what their mental states would be. So for example, right back in the Pali Canon, the earliest records we have of the life of teaching the Buddha, we meet a householder called Mahanama. And Mahanama is concerned. He's concerned. The Buddha's about to leave his village, and he is concerned about how he will continue practicing when the Buddha goes off on his wanderings. How's he going to do it? So he asked the Buddha, where should we dwell when you are no longer here? Well, I think there's a bit of a joke there. There are jokes in the Pali Canon. Where should we dwell when you are no longer here? Well, Mahanama's going to be dwelling in the same place. What's the meaning of that? Physically, Mahanama is going to be dwelling where he's always dwelt, where his family lives, where his livelihood is. His town or village, I can't remember where he lives actually. It's the Buddha who's leaving, not Mahanama. It's the Buddha who will no longer be dwelling there. So asking where should I dwell when you leave doesn't make sense if we take it physically. But of course, what Mahanama means is where should my mind dwell? Where should my mind dwell when you are no longer here? While you are here, my mind dwells on you. You are a big feature of my mind. How I think and feel and act is influenced by you, the Buddha. But where should my mind dwell when you're no longer here? And the Buddha tells him, first and foremost, he gives him several things, but the biggest one, or the first one he says is, first and foremost, let your mind dwell on me. Remember me. Reflect on me and the qualities of enlightenment. Keep me in your mind. And he says, when we do that, our mind heads straight. Our mind heads straight, which is a phrase I really quite like. Our mind heads straight towards enlightenment when we keep our mind on enlightenment. So the Buddha represents what we human beings have the potential to become. So what the Buddha is telling Mahanama is keep what you could become in your mind. Keep what you could become in your mind. Keep what Mahanama could become in your mind. Keep the potential Mahanama that you could be, that could come into existence in the future. Keep that as an object in your mind so that that influences how you act and think and speak and feel in the present. So we have here a really early example of the practice called recollection of the Buddha, which becomes just a huge practice pretty much throughout Buddhism after the Buddha's death. Keeping the Buddha in mind, keeping, in effect, what we ourselves could become in our mind so that we are affected by it, so that our present is affected by our possible future. So we bring the future into the present, let it affect us, act as if we were already a more enlightened being than we are. And then again, so that's the example of Mahanama. And then again, in what's reckoned to be the sort of very oldest part of the Pali Canon, closest to the Buddha's actual words, because the Pali Canon was probably a bit messed around with. In one of the oldest parts of the Pali Canon, first to be written down, we meet an old man called Pingya, who is too old to go and spend time with the Buddha, and who makes it his whole practice to meditate on the Buddha, to focus his mind on the Buddha by day as well as night. In effect, to focus his mind on what he, Pingya, could become by day as well as by night. So Pingya says, well, there's not a moment I spend away from the Buddha. So Pingya tells his former teacher, what he says is, with constant mindfulness, it is possible for me to see him with my mind as clearly as with my eyes, by night as well as day. There is not a single moment spent away from him. And Pingya tells us that because of this, his mind is constantly imbued with confidence and joy, with wisdom and awareness. He says, whichever way this universe of wisdom moves, it draws me with it. So Pingia is keeping his mind on what he himself could become, and that draws him with it. That becomes what moves his mind. What his being in the present is determined by that possible future, the enlightened Pingia, not what Pingia has been in the past. And because of that, his mind is full of confidence and joy, wisdom and awareness. So Pingia's example gives us a foretaste of what became known as these visualization practices that I've been talking about, which is such a big part of Tantric Buddhism. Pingia tells us, with mindfulness, it is possible for me to see him with my mind as well as with my eyes, by night as well as day. So he's not just reflecting on the Buddha and calling his qualities to mind in a sort of abstract way. He's doing what many, many later Buddhists have done all down through the centuries. He's visualizing, I imagine, a sort of glorified, visionary, imaginal form of the Buddha, a form that conveys something of the Buddha's inner magnificence, rather than just seeing an ordinary human body of an ordinary and rather dusty and travel-worn human dressed in some rather ragged, dusty clothes, dusty cast-off robes. So Pingia is visualizing the Buddha in the way that Tantric practitioners, and for that matter, members of our order, visualize either the Buddha Shakyamuni or some other figure, some other archetypal Buddha or Bodhisattva. And then towards the end of this really significant passage about Pingia in the Pali Canon, the Buddha himself gives his sort of seal of approval to the way Pingia is practicing. He says, so the Buddha says, let this practice free you. Others have freed themselves by this style of practice. Let this practice free you. You too will go to the further shore, beyond the reach of death. So he's saying this practice will take you all the way to enlightenment. And then as the passage ends with a very short, very simple, but I think very moving sentence where Pingia says of himself, you may consider this as mind released. You may consider this as mind released. In effect, he's saying, that's it, I've done it. My mind is now free, which is quite a statement. So Pingia, again, is an early example of someone who achieves the release of mind through meditating on the Buddha. Early example of someone who, as the Buddha puts it, goes to the other shore, not just by building on the past, but by bringing the future into the present, by bringing the future Pingia, if you like, into the present and letting that guide him. In the form of the Buddha, being guided by that. So he's an early example of a style of practice that's continued down the centuries and developed into the sadhana practices that most ordinary members do and the yidam practices of Tantric Buddhism. But you might be thinking. That is, what we've been talking about is all about meditating on the Buddha. But not all order members meditate on the Buddha. They also meditate on figures like Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, with his 1,000 arms sometimes, or Manjughosha, the embodiment of transcendental wisdom, or Vajrapani, the archetype of energy and strength, or female figures like Tara and Prajnaparamita. They're not the Buddha. And that's just within the order. That's just within our order. Some of the figures that Tantric practitioners in other traditions meditate on are deeply weird. Sometimes with loads of legs and loads of wings and trampling on embodies and having sex at the same time. Maybe drinking what looks like blood. Not at the same time. Yeah, maybe at the same time. Distinctly weird. If you want to see how weird, have a look at Vasantra's book on Tantric deities. So how did that happen? Why isn't everybody still meditating on the original Buddha Shakyamuni? Why lots of wings and having sex? Well, people in our order don't meditate on figures with lots of wings or figures having sex. If you want, if you want that, you might have to find another Buddhist group. Sorry. But the question remains, why do even order members meditate on figures like Manjughosha and Tara and not the Buddha? Well, I could give a rationalist's answer to that. In fact, I'm going to give a rationalist's answer to that and say that enlightenment has got lots and lots of qualities like compassion and wisdom and energy and freedom and creativity. So it can be difficult for one symbol, the symbol of the Buddha, to, as it were, hold and convey all of these different qualities. If someone is seeking to develop more compassion, say, it might be easier for them to focus on a figure like Avalokiteshvara or Tara, who sort of majors on compassion and metta, rather than the Buddha, who manifests all the enlightened qualities at once, so that none of them can be picked out quite so clearly. So over time, maybe a range of different figures, as it were, developed that people could meditate on, embodying different aspects of enlightenment, because that made those different aspects of enlightenment more accessible through those practices. That would be a rationalist explanation, and I'm sure that's part of the story. But it makes it sound as though these different figures are sort of made up, just the product of the ordinary imagination. And as though, we could just invent our own. Well, I'd like a sort of pink furry Bodhisattva with spots, that would really get me going. But people who do these practices, they do not experience these figures as just imaginary figures. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we make up our own figures, spots or not, they won't have anything like the depth or the power. So rather than saying, well, we've sort of come up with these figures to make different aspects of enlightenment more accessible, I think it would be truer to say that over the centuries, in deep meditation, people experienced deep archetypes, deep forces within the collective psyche, deep forces within reality itself, which expressed themselves in visual form, and were then incorporated into meditation practices so that others could follow in the footsteps of the original meditator. Or even to say that reality itself, the enlightened mind itself, tried to communicate itself to meditators through these forms. And then these forms became meditations in their own right, which acted as gateways to the enlightened mind. Something like that. But if that's just too weird, forget I said it. I see a few people going, if that's too weird, maybe just settle for the idea that these figures represent different aspects of enlightenment. And keep an open mind, if you can, about them being maybe a bit more than that, maybe a bit more powerful than that. But anyway, it was these meditations on different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that developed from the original practice of meditating on the Buddha, the historical Buddha, that became these yidam practices, sadhana practices. And they became a completely central part of Tantric Buddhism. They fitted perfectly with the tantric emphasis on acting now as an enlightened being, imagining ourselves now as an enlightened being, acting from that, rather than just seeing practice as about slowly growing to become more of an enlightened being. Okay, so needing to draw to a close, how do we get some of that? If you haven't got a sadhana practice, how might you get some of that? Okay, that would be my first question. Ask, is there a figure that you connect with? Is there a figure that you connect with? It's most likely to be the Buddha, actually. It's most likely to be the Buddha, but maybe not. Maybe there's a figure you connect with. Have a shrine with that figure on it. Bow to that figure as you before you meditate and after you meditate. Maybe chant the mantra of that figure at the beginning of your meditations, maybe at the end of your meditations. Form a connection with that figure. Maybe when you do the mindfulness of breathing, imagine doing it in the presence of that Buddha or Bodhisattva. Feeling the influence of that Buddha or Bodhisattva. Maybe when you do the metta bhavana, imagine yourself feeling the metta that figure has for you and for all beings, rather than sort of pumping up our own metta. Imagine that experiencing metta that's all around us, so that you're joining in with their metta. And then think of that figure as you go about your life. Keep that figure in mind as much as you can. As Pingyur says, with constant mindfulness, he's able to keep the Buddha in mind. Keep that figure, the Buddha or that figure in mind as you go about your daily life as much as you can. And allow that to influence the way you think and act and speak, because it will. If you can keep that figure in mind, it will influence that. And then you could, of course, think of situations where you normally act in a way which you know is not particularly enlightened, and just sort of rehearse in your mind going into them and acting more like an enlightened being. How would that meeting with a difficult person or that meeting at work or whatever be if I were an enlightened being? Well, maybe I could try doing that. We're probably not going to manage it all the time, but we could try that, bring the future into the present. And finally, take what we call our Shraddha seriously. So these practices, they sort of depend on us having a connection to the future self that we could be. And in Buddhism, I think that connection is what we call Shraddha. Shraddha is often translated as faith, but faith usually means believing something, often something completely unbelievable. Shraddha means something a bit different. It means a sort of heart connection to something beyond ourselves. Sangha said it means the response of what's ultimate in us to what's ultimate in the universe. I would say we could also think about it as our future self calling to us. And we often have an intuitive heart sense of the direction we should be going. And that is the future calling to us. And I think just take that very, very seriously. And if we do that, we'll be acting much more like a magician and allowing our life to be ruled by the future rather than the past. Thank you.